I always believed that family meant everything, that blood was thicker than water, that loyalty meant enduring anything, and that love required endless sacrifice. My name is Sarah Chon, and for 28 years, I lived by these principles until the day I realized they were slowly killing me. Growing up in San Francisco's Richmond district, I was the eldest daughter in a traditional Chinese-American family. My parents, immigrants who had sacrificed everything to build a new life in America, carried with them the weight of expectation that their children would not only succeed but excel beyond their wildest dreams. My father worked 16-hour days at his small electronics repair shop, while my mother cleaned office buildings at night to make ends meet. Their sacrifices were real, tangible, and became the foundation upon which my entire sense of obligation was built. The Richmond district in the 1990s was a maze of foggy streets lined with aging Victorian houses converted into apartments and small family businesses. Our apartment was on the second floor of a narrow building that always smelled like the dim sum restaurant below. The walls were thin enough that I could hear Mrs. Wong's television through my bedroom wall and the constant hum of traffic on Geary Boulevard. My parents had chosen this neighborhood because it was affordable and had a substantial Chinese population, but also because it represented their compromise between maintaining cultural identity and pursuing American opportunities. Our apartment consisted of 3 small bedrooms, a cramped kitchen where my mother performed daily miracles with limited ingredients and space, and a living room that doubled as my father's home office where he spread repair manuals and electronic components across a card table every evening. The furniture was a collection of secondhand pieces and gifts from other immigrant families who had upgraded their circumstances. Nothing matched, but everything was meticulously clean and maintained with the pride of people who understood that possessions, however humble, represented security in an uncertain world. From the moment I could understand words, I knew my role in the family hierarchy. I was the responsible one, the achiever, the daughter who would make all their struggles worthwhile. My younger brother Kevin, 3 years my junior, was coddled and protected from the harsh realities that I was expected to shoulder from childhood. The difference in our treatment was stark and consistent, though it took me years to understand that this disparity was not normal or healthy. When Kevin struggled with reading in elementary school, my parents hired a tutor and bought him special books with large print and colorful illustrations. When I struggled with advanced mathematics concepts that were above my grade level, I was told to figure it out myself because I was smart enough and because the family couldn't afford additional educational expenses for both children. When Kevin wanted expensive sneakers that all his classmates wore, they appeared under the Christmas tree along with the latest video game console. When I asked for art supplies to support my growing interest in drawing and painting, I was reminded about the family's financial situation and told that practical pursuits were more important than hobbies that wouldn't lead to stable careers. The pattern established itself early and deepened with each passing year. Kevin's failures were met with understanding and additional support, while my successes were expected and minimally acknowledged. When he brought home report cards filled with C's and D's, my parents scheduled parent-teacher conferences and discussed learning disabilities and alternative teaching methods. When I brought home straight A's, the response was typically a brief nod and a reminder that high grades were expected, not exceptional. I learned to excel not because achievement brought joy or recognition, but because failure was not an option that existed in my universe. The pressure was constant but rarely explicitly stated, communicated instead through sighs, worried conversations between my parents that I was meant to overhear, and comparisons to other families whose children were apparently surpassing expectations in ways that reflected poorly on our household. School became my sanctuary and my proving ground. I threw myself into academics with an intensity that concerned my teachers but impressed my parents. By middle school, I was enrolled in advanced classes, participated in academic competitions, and spent my lunch periods in the library rather than socializing with classmates. The social isolation was a small price to pay for the brief moments of approval I received when bringing home awards or recognition. My artistic inclinations, however, remained a source of tension and secret shame. I loved to draw, particularly portraits and landscapes that captured the subtle emotions I couldn't express in words. My sketchbooks were filled with images of the foggy Richmond streets, the tired faces of my parents, and the complex emotions of adolescence that I was processing largely alone. But art was viewed as impractical, a luxury that families like ours couldn't afford to indulge. The one person who understood and encouraged my artistic interests was my maternal grandmother, Papa, who lived with us during my early teenage years. Papa had been a seamstress in China and possessed an aesthetic sensibility that she recognized and nurtured in me. She would sit with me at the kitchen table while I drew, offering gentle suggestions and telling me stories about the beautiful fabrics and intricate embroidery she had created in her youth. Art feeds the soul, she would say in her mixture of Cantonese and broken English. Soul needs feeding just like body. You remember this, little one. Popo's death during my sophomore year of high school marked the end of the only relationship in my family where I felt genuinely seen and valued for who I was rather than what I could achieve. Her passing also coincided with a significant escalation in family expectations and financial pressure that would define the rest of my adolescence. I graduated valedictorian from high school, earned a full scholarship to UC Berkeley, and immediately declared a major in computer science, not because I loved technology, but because my parents had deemed it the most financially promising path. My secret love for art and literature was pushed aside, relegated to stolen moments when I sketched in the margins of my engineering textbooks or wrote poetry in the quiet hours before dawn. The decision to major in computer science was presented as my choice, but the pressure had been so subtle and persistent that I genuinely believed I was choosing freely. My parents spoke frequently about the technology boom happening just across the bay, the enormous salaries that software engineers commanded, and the security that a technical degree would provide. They clipped newspaper articles about successful Asian American tech entrepreneurs and left them on my desk with highlighted sections about their educational backgrounds and career trajectories. When I expressed mild interest in double majoring or perhaps taking additional art classes, the response was swift and decisive. You can pursue hobbies after you establish your career, my mother explained with the patient tone she used when correcting obvious errors in judgment. Right now, you need to focus on subjects that will support you financially. Art is beautiful, but artists starve. College should have been my liberation, but instead, it became an extension of my family obligations. Every weekend, I returned home to help with household chores, translate documents for my parents who still struggled with English despite decades in America, and tutor Kevin through his increasingly difficult coursework. The commute between Berkeley and San Francisco consumed 4 to 6 hours every weekend, time that my classmates spent studying, socializing, or exploring internship opportunities. While my classmates formed study groups and attended social events, I spent my evenings explaining algebra concepts to my brother and helping my mother navigate parent-teacher conferences, medical appointments, and bureaucratic procedures that required fluent English. I became the family's unofficial translator and advocate, responsibilities that required not just language skills, but cultural navigation between my parents' expectations and American institutional requirements. The emotional labor was exhausting and largely invisible. I mediated conflicts between Kevin and my parents when his grades slipped or when he violated family rules. I researched colleges and scholarship opportunities for him, while my own academic performance suffered from divided attention. I attended his school events and parent conferences when my parents' work schedules conflicted, essentially functioning as a surrogate parent despite being only 3 years older. The financial pressure was constant and suffocating. Although my tuition was covered by scholarships, I worked 3 part-time jobs to support myself and send money home whenever unexpected expenses arose. I worked at the campus library, tutored struggling students in computer science, and had a weekend job at a small tech repair shop that reminded me of my father's business. Between classes, work, and family obligations, I rarely slept more than 5 or 6 hours per night. When the family car broke down during my sophomore year, requiring expensive transmission repairs, I depleted my savings account to help cover the costs. The decision was presented as temporary, with promises of repayment that never materialized. When my father's shop needed new diagnostic equipment to remain competitive, I took out a student loan to contribute to the purchase, reasoning that the investment would improve the family's long-term financial stability. Each financial crisis followed the same pattern: urgent need, family consultation that was really a notification of my expected contribution, and grateful acceptance that never quite acknowledged the sacrifice involved. The gratitude was real but short-lived. quickly replaced by planning for the next challenge or opportunity that would require my resources. Kevin, meanwhile, coasted through high school with mediocre grades and an attitude of entitlement that seemed to grow stronger with each passing semester. His academic struggles were attributed to learning differences and the difficulty of living up to my example, while his behavioral problems were dismissed as typical teenage rebellion. When he was caught cheating on an important exam, my parents hired an attorney to contest the academic penalty. When he was arrested for underage drinking, they paid for legal representation and court fees without requiring him to face meaningful consequences. The contrast in our treatment became increasingly obvious and painful. When I received academic recognition or internship opportunities, the family response was brief acknowledgement followed by discussions of how these achievements could benefit Kevin's college applications or the family's financial situation. When Kevin barely passed his classes or got into trouble, the family mobilized to provide support, protection, and resources without question. During my junior year at Berkeley, the conversation that would shape the next phase of my life took place on a Sunday evening in our cramped kitchen, the air thick with the smell of my mother's cooking and unspoken expectations. I had returned home for the weekend to help Kevin with college applications, a process that had been ongoing for months without significant progress. "Sarah, you're doing so well with your computer studies," my mother began, her voice carrying that particular tone I had learned to dread. "Kevin needs help getting started, just until he finds his direction." My father nodded from behind his newspaper, a prop he often used to avoid direct eye contact during difficult conversations. "Family helps family. You understand this." The specific request was for me to not only help finance Kevin's community college education, but also to provide him with a monthly allowance while he lived at home and focused on his studies. The amount they suggested was substantial, nearly equivalent to my rent and food expenses, and would require me to take on additional work or loans to maintain my own standard of living. I did understand. I understood that my success was never truly mine, that every achievement was expected to be shared, diluted, and redistributed according to family need rather than personal merit. But at 20 years old, I didn't yet have the vocabulary or the courage to articulate the resentment that had been building in my chest like pressure in a sealed container. The family dynamic had created a situation where my compliance was assumed rather than requested. The conversation was not about whether I would help Kevin, but about the logistics of how that help would be structured and delivered. My input was welcome regarding implementation details, but not regarding the fundamental decision itself. After graduation, I secured a software engineering position at a prestigious tech company in Silicon Valley. The salary was substantial, far more than I had ever imagined earning at such a young age. For the first time in my life, I experienced a brief moment of pride that was entirely my own. I rented a small apartment in Mountain View, bought my first car, and began to taste the independence I had always craved. The apartment was tiny but clean and modern, with large windows that let in California sunshine and a small balcony where I could sit with my coffee and sketchbook in the mornings. The furniture was minimal but chosen by me, reflecting my own taste rather than financial desperation or family hand-me-downs. For 6 weeks, I lived like the successful young professional I had always imagined becoming. That taste of freedom lasted exactly 6 weeks. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening as I was preparing dinner in my tiny kitchen, enjoying the simple pleasure of cooking for myself. My mother's voice was strained, worried, and immediately I felt my stomach clench with familiar anxiety. "Sarah, we need to talk to you. Can you come home this weekend?" The conversation that followed would become the template for the next 7 years of my life. Kevin had dropped out of community college after 1 semester, accumulated significant credit card debt pursuing what he called networking opportunities and business investments, and moved back home with no job and no plan. The credit card debt exceeded $8,000, money he had spent on expensive dinners, concert tickets, and electronic equipment that he claimed were necessary for his social media marketing business that had never generated any income. My parents, rather than addressing his behavior or setting boundaries, had decided that the solution was for me to consolidate his debt and provide monthly financial support while he figured out his next steps. The proposal was presented as a business arrangement, with promises of eventual repayment and gratitude that felt more like emotional manipulation than genuine appreciation. "It's just temporary," My father assured me as we sat in the living room where I had spent countless hours doing homework and dreaming of escape, just until he gets back on his feet. How much? I asked, though I already suspected the answer would be more than I could comfortably afford. Maybe $2,000 a month, my mother suggested, as if the amount were negligible. You're making good money now. This is what family does. $2,000 was nearly half my take-home pay after taxes and living expenses. It would mean abandoning any hope of saving money, postponing my dreams of eventually starting my own business, and remaining financially vulnerable indefinitely. But the weight of their expectation, the guilt embedded in every conversation about their sacrifices, and my own desperate need for their approval made refusal feel impossible. The conversation continued for hours, with my parents presenting detailed explanations of Kevin's situation, their own financial limitations, and my moral obligation as the successful sibling. They had prepared responses to every objection I might raise, creating a web of logic that made my resistance seem selfish and unreasonable. I agreed, telling myself it would only be for a few months. The few months stretched into a year, then 2, then 5. Kevin showed no signs of motivation or improvement. He dabbled in various get-rich-quick schemes that required additional startup funding, started and abandoned online courses that promised quick entry into lucrative careers, and occasionally held temporary jobs that lasted a few weeks before he quit due to personality conflicts or was fired for attendance problems. His living situation at home became increasingly comfortable and permanent. My parents renovated the basement into a private apartment for him, complete with updated appliances and entertainment equipment. They justified these expenses as investments in his eventual independence, but the effect was to create a luxurious retreat that removed any incentive for him to develop self-sufficiency. Through it all, my parents protected him from consequences while continuing to pressure me for more support. When Kevin crashed the family car while driving without insurance, I was expected to help pay for repairs and legal fees. When he decided he needed professional equipment for his latest business idea, I was presented with detailed research about industry standards and market opportunities that made the purchases seem reasonable and necessary. The requests escalated gradually, almost imperceptibly. First, it was help with rent when my father's business experienced a slow period due to increased competition from chain electronics stores. Then contributions toward home repairs that couldn't be delayed, including a new roof, updated electrical work, and plumbing upgrades that somehow always cost more than originally estimated. When my mother developed diabetes and needed medication not fully covered by insurance, I was expected to bridge the gap without question. When my father's arthritis worsened and affected his ability to perform detailed repair work, I funded ergonomic equipment and considered paying for an assistant to help with the physical demands of his job. Each request came with detailed explanations of the family's financial strain and subtle reminders of my obligation as the successful daughter. The conversations followed a predictable pattern: urgent need, detailed financial analysis, emotional appeals to family loyalty, and grateful acceptance that assumed my compliance rather than requesting it. By my 27th birthday, I was essentially supporting 3 adults while barely maintaining my own standard of living. I had postponed vacations, avoided social activities that cost money, and watched my savings account hover perpetually near zero despite earning a salary that should have provided financial security and opportunities for advancement. My tiny apartment had become a prison of my own making, furnished with second-hand items because every spare dollar was funneled back to my family. I drove a reliable but aging Honda Civic that I maintained myself rather than paying for professional service. My wardrobe consisted largely of clothing purchased during college or received as gifts, supplemented by occasional purchases from discount retailers when professional requirements demanded updates. The isolation was perhaps the most devastating aspect of my situation. I had learned to decline invitations from colleagues because I couldn't afford restaurants, weekend trips, or social activities that my peers took for granted. The friends I had made in college gradually stopped reaching out as I consistently canceled plans at the last minute due to family obligations or financial constraints. My romantic life was non-existent, partly because I had no time or energy for dating, but mostly because I was ashamed of my financial situation and the complex web of family dependence that defined my existence. The few dates I attempted ended awkwardly when conversations turned to personal goals, family relationships, or future plans that I couldn't discuss honestly without revealing the extent of my circumstances. During this period, Kevin not only failed to improve his circumstances, but seemed to actively resent my success and the family attention that my achievements generated. Family gatherings became uncomfortable affairs where he would make passive-aggressive comments about my easy life and suggest that my education and career were somehow undeserved advantages rather than the result of consistent effort and sacrifice. "Must be nice to have everything handed to you," he said during one particularly painful dinner conversation, referring to my scholarship opportunities and job placement services that he claimed were available only to students with perfect grades. "I worked for everything I have," I replied quietly, but my mother immediately intervened with her characteristic diplomatic tone that always favored peace over accuracy. "Kevin, Sarah just got lucky with timing. And Sarah, you know Kevin is still finding his way. Not everyone has your advantages." The constant minimization of my efforts and achievements created a persistent sense of unreality. I began to question whether I had indeed simply been lucky, whether my accomplishments were as hollow as my family seemed to believe. The confidence I had built during college slowly eroded under the weight of their collective dismissal and the practical constraints of my financial obligations. Meanwhile, my career stagnated as I struggled to focus on professional development while managing family crises. Colleagues began to notice my distraction and stress, particularly during periods when family emergencies required me to miss important meetings or decline travel opportunities. I watched younger engineers join the company and surpass me in both responsibility and compensation, while I remained trapped in a cycle of obligation and resentment. The company offered professional development opportunities including advanced training programs, industry conferences, and leadership development courses that could have accelerated my career progression. I declined most of these opportunities because they required time away from family obligations or financial investments that I couldn't afford while supporting Kevin and contributing to household expenses. My direct supervisor, Jennifer Martinez, was a successful Latina engineer who had navigated similar cultural pressures in her own career. She began to notice my pattern of declining opportunities and scheduled a private meeting to discuss my professional trajectory. "Sarah, you're one of our most talented engineers, but you're not advancing at the pace your skills warrant," she said with the directness I had come to appreciate. "Is there something preventing you from taking on additional responsibilities or pursuing growth opportunities?" I struggled to explain my situation without revealing the family dynamics that controlled my schedule and finances. Professional environments, I had learned, operated on assumptions of individual autonomy and personal prioritization that didn't accommodate the complex web of obligation that defined my existence. "I have some family responsibilities that limit my flexibility," I said carefully. Jennifer nodded with understanding that suggested she had navigated similar challenges. "Family obligations are important, but you also need to invest in your own future. The opportunities you're declining now may not be available later, and your career development affects your long-term ability to support yourself and your family." Her words haunted me because they highlighted the contradiction at the center of my life. By sacrificing my professional growth to meet immediate family needs, I was potentially limiting my future earning capacity and creating long-term financial vulnerability that would ultimately hurt everyone I was trying to help. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in late October, during what had been a particularly stressful period at work. I had been working on a particularly challenging project that required innovative solutions to complex technical problems, the kind of assignment that could establish my reputation as a senior engineer and open doors to leadership opportunities. The project deadline was approaching, and I had been working late every night to compensate for the time I had lost to family obligations earlier in the month. My phone rang with yet another crisis call from home, interrupting my concentration during crucial debugging work that required sustained focus and attention to detail. Kevin had been arrested for driving under the influence, his second such incident in 18 months. The first arrest had been handled quietly with legal representation that my parents had funded through a combination of savings withdrawals and credit card advances. This second arrest carried more serious consequences, including potential jail time, license suspension, and mandatory alcohol treatment programs. My parents needed $5,000 immediately for bail and legal fees, plus additional funds for the attorney consultation and court costs that would follow. The demand was presented not as a request, but as an emergency requiring immediate action to prevent Kevin from spending the weekend in jail, an outcome that my parents described as catastrophic for his self-esteem and future prospects. "You have to help him," my mother said, her voice thick with tears and panic. "He's your brother. This is what family does." I sat in my cubicle, surrounded by the quiet hum of office productivity and the evidence of my own professional capabilities, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. The words that had controlled my life for nearly 3 decades suddenly sounded hollow, manipulative, and cruel. This is what family does. But what had my family ever done for me beyond providing the basic necessities of childhood and then leveraging those gifts into a lifetime of obligation? The contrast between my current environment and the crisis being demanded of my attention was stark and illuminating. I was surrounded by colleagues who were solving complex problems, advancing their careers, and building futures based on their own efforts and decisions. Meanwhile, I was being asked to abandon my professional responsibilities to rescue someone who had consistently refused to accept responsibility for his own choices and consequences. "Mom, I can't," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the trembling in my hands. "What do you mean you can't?" The shock in her voice was palpable. In 27 years, I had never refused a direct request for money, no matter how inconvenient or financially damaging. I mean, I don't have $5,000 available, and even if I did, I wouldn't use it to bail Kevin out of a situation he created through his own poor choices. The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had. My mother alternated between pleading and accusations, painting me as selfish and ungrateful while simultaneously describing Kevin as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. She reminded me of every sacrifice she and my father had made, every opportunity they had provided, and every expectation I was now callously abandoning. She threatened to cut me off entirely, to never speak to me again, to tell the entire extended family how I had abandoned my brother in his time of need. The threats were detailed and specific, designed to trigger every insecurity and fear that had been carefully cultivated throughout my childhood and adolescence. For the first time in my adult life, I let her speak without arguing, without defending myself, without immediately capitulating to make the discomfort stop. I listened to the manipulation tactics that had controlled me for decades and recognized them clearly for what they were. The guilt, the emotional blackmail, the redefinition of my success as family property, the transformation of my brother's failures into my moral obligations. When she finally exhausted herself, I spoke with a clarity that surprised us both. "Mom, I love you and Dad, and I even love Kevin despite everything. But I will not continue to enable his destructive behavior or sacrifice my own future to subsidize his choices. I have given this family hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past 7 years, and the only result has been Kevin getting worse and my own life becoming smaller and more desperate." The words continued to flow with startling honesty and precision. I enumerated the specific ways that the family's financial dependence had limited my opportunities, damaged my health, and prevented me from building the kind of stable, independent life that would actually benefit everyone in the long term. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, my mother's voice turned cold with a finality that chilled me to the bone. "If that's how you really feel, then I guess you're not the daughter we raised. Don't expect us to be here when you finally realize how wrong you are." She hung up, and I sat in my cubicle surrounded by the normal sounds of office life, while my world completely shifted on its axis. The relationship that had defined my existence for 27 years had just ended with a dial tone. The weekend that followed was the most terrifying and liberating period of my life. I stayed in my apartment, turned off my phone, and allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had transpired. The panic was overwhelming at times, accompanied by waves of guilt that made me question whether I had made a terrible mistake that would haunt me forever. I had been conditioned to believe that family approval was essential for survival, and its sudden absence felt like standing on the edge of an abyss. The voices in my head, trained by years of conditioning, provided a constant stream of criticism and second-guessing. I was selfish, ungrateful, heartless. I had abandoned my family when they needed me most. I would regret this decision for the rest of my life. But as the hours passed, something unexpected emerged from beneath the fear and guilt. Relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't checking my phone every few minutes for the next family crisis. I wasn't calculating how much money I could spare from my budget or planning explanations for why I couldn't attend another family obligation that would leave me exhausted and resentful. The silence was initially frightening, but gradually became peaceful. I cooked meals without interruption, read books that I had purchased months earlier but never had time to open, and slept for 10 uninterrupted hours on Saturday night, waking up naturally rather than to the sound of my phone ringing with the latest emergency. On Sunday evening, I called my best friend from college, Maya, whom I hadn't spoken to in over a year due to the constant demands on my time and emotional energy. She lived in Los Angeles now, working as a graphic designer and living the kind of independent, creative life that I had once imagined for myself. When I explained what had happened, her response was immediate and fierce. "Sarah, I've been watching you disappear for years. You've been giving and giving until there's nothing left of the person I knew in college. I'm proud of you for finally standing up for yourself. But what if they never forgive me?" I asked, voicing the fear that had been consuming me all weekend. "What if they don't?" Maya replied gently. "Would that actually make your life worse than it is right now?" The question haunted me because the honest answer was no. The constant stress, financial strain, and emotional manipulation had created a life that barely resembled living. I was 37 years old, professionally stagnant, socially isolated, and emotionally depleted. The love I had been fighting so desperately to preserve had become indistinguishable from abuse. Maya's voice continued with the clarity of someone who had observed my situation from the outside. "Sarah, real love doesn't require you to sacrifice your dreams, your financial security, or your peace of mind. Real love wants you to thrive, not just survive." Monday morning brought a flood of text messages and voicemails from various family members who had been recruited to pressure me into changing my mind. Aunts, uncles, and cousins I rarely spoke to suddenly became concerned about family unity and tradition, contacting me with messages that followed a predictable pattern: expressions of disappointment, reminders of family obligation, and subtle threats about consequences if I didn't reconcile immediately. The messages revealed the extent to which my family had discussed my situation with the broader community, transforming my private decision into a public drama that required collective intervention. I was portrayed as the ungrateful daughter who had forgotten her roots and abandoned her responsibilities, while Kevin was presented as a victim of circumstance who deserved unconditional support. I deleted them all without responding. Instead, I made an appointment with a therapist, something I had been considering for years but never prioritized due to time and financial constraints. Dr. Jennifer Walsh specialized in family systems and cultural identity issues, and her office in downtown Palo Alto was a calm sanctuary decorated with plants and artwork that immediately put me at ease. During our first session, she helped me understand that my experience was far from unique, particularly among children of immigrants who had been raised with traditional family obligation structures that hadn't adapted to American individualistic values. Many children of immigrants struggle with boundary setting because family sacrifice is presented as both a survival strategy and a moral imperative, she explained in a voice that was both professional and compassionate. But healthy families eventually transition from survival mode to supporting individual growth and independence. When that transition doesn't happen, children can become trapped in patterns that prevent them from developing into fully realized adults. The therapy sessions became the foundation for a complete reconstruction of my understanding of family, obligation, and self-worth. Dr. Walsh helped me recognize the difference between healthy family support and dysfunctional codependence, between cultural values and manipulative control tactics, between love and emotional extortion. Over the following months, therapy became my lifeline as I navigated the complex process of rebuilding my identity separate from family expectations. I learned to recognize manipulation tactics, to differentiate between guilt and genuine obligation, and to understand that love without respect is not truly love at all. The practical changes came gradually but consistently. I moved to a larger apartment in a neighborhood I actually enjoyed, rather than the cheapest option available. The new apartment had hardwood floors, updated appliances, and a small balcony garden where I could grow herbs and flowers. For the first time since college, I had space that reflected my personality rather than my financial limitations. I bought furniture that reflected my personal taste rather than financial desperation, including a comfortable sofa where I could read and relax, and a proper desk where I could work on personal projects and sketching. I enrolled in an evening art class at a local community center, reconnecting with the creative passion I had abandoned years earlier. The art class was taught by Elena Rodriguez, a professional artist who worked primarily in watercolors and mixed media. She created an environment where creativity was valued for its own sake rather than its potential for financial return. For the first time in years, I spent time engaged in activities that brought me joy rather than stress, that fed my soul rather than depleted my energy. For the first time since college, I had money in my savings account and space in my schedule to pursue interests beyond survival. The relief was profound and occasionally overwhelming. I would sometimes find myself crying at unexpected moments, not from sadness, but from the release of tension I had carried for so long that I had forgotten what relaxation felt like. The professional transformation was equally dramatic. Without the constant distraction of family crises, my work performance improved significantly. I was able to focus completely on complex projects, volunteer for challenging assignments, and attend industry conferences that expanded my knowledge and professional network. Within 6 months of setting boundaries with my family, I received a promotion that included both increased responsibility and a substantial salary raise. The promotion came with leadership responsibilities for a small team of junior engineers, providing me with management experience and visibility within the company that opened doors to even greater opportunities. Jennifer Martinez, my supervisor, commented on the dramatic improvement in my focus and productivity. Whatever changes you've made in your personal life, they're clearly working professionally as well, she said during my performance review. You seem more confident, more decisive, and more engaged with long-term career planning. The social rebuilding process was slower and more painful. Years of isolation had left me with atrophied social skills and deep insecurity about forming new relationships. I had forgotten how to make casual conversation, how to maintain friendships that weren't based on crisis management, and how to present myself as someone worth getting to know rather than someone perpetually overwhelmed by obligations. But gradually, I began accepting invitations from colleagues and joining social groups related to my interests. I discovered that many people were drawn to authenticity and genuine connection rather than the perfect facade I had thought was necessary. I joined a hiking group that met on weekends, a book club that discussed contemporary fiction, and a volunteer organization that taught computer skills to senior citizens. The volunteer work was particularly meaningful because it allowed me to use my technical expertise to help people without creating the kind of dysfunctional dependence that had characterized my family relationships. The seniors I worked with were grateful for my assistance, but maintained their independence and dignity, creating the kind of mutually respectful exchange that I was learning to value and expect. 8 months after our last conversation, my mother called. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Her voice was subdued, lacking the righteous anger that had characterized our previous interaction. Sarah, it's Mom. I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I wanted you to know that Kevin is in rehab. He had another arrest, and this time the judge ordered treatment. Your father and I are starting to see some things differently. Maybe we could talk sometime, if you're willing. I didn't call back immediately. Dr. Walsh and I spent several sessions discussing the complexities of potential reconciliation and the importance of maintaining the boundaries I had worked so hard to establish. The conversation covered the difference between forgiveness and trust, between rebuilding relationships and returning to dysfunctional patterns, between healing and enabling. When I finally did return the call 2 weeks later, the conversation was unlike any we had ever had. My mother began with something she had never offered before, an apology. Not a conditional apology that blamed circumstances or other people, but a recognition that she and my father had treated me unfairly and caused me significant harm. We were so focused on survival and Kevin's struggles that we forgot you were also our child, she said, her voice thick with emotion. We took advantage of your strength and your love, and we were wrong. The conversation was difficult, emotional, and incomplete. Years of hurt could not be resolved in a single phone call, and trust could not be rebuilt overnight. But it was a beginning, an acknowledgement that change was possible even in relationships that seemed permanently broken. My mother explained that Kevin's court-ordered treatment had included family therapy sessions that forced them to examine their own behavior and its impact on both their children. The therapist had helped them understand how their well-intentioned efforts to protect Kevin had actually enabled his destructive behavior, while simultaneously exploiting my sense of responsibility and guilt. Kevin's treatment program included family therapy sessions, some of which I chose to attend after careful consideration and preparation with Dr. Walsh. The process was painful as years of resentment and dysfunction were examined under professional guidance. The family therapist, Dr. Michael Chun, specialized in addiction recovery and family systems, bringing both cultural sensitivity and clinical expertise to our complex situation. Kevin's addiction issues, which the family had minimized and enabled for years, were addressed directly and honestly for the first time. His alcohol abuse, gambling problems, and pattern of financial irresponsibility were identified as symptoms of underlying issues that required professional treatment rather than family bailouts. My parents' cultural trauma and financial anxiety were explored as contributing factors to their controlling behavior and excessive focus on Kevin's needs. Dr. Chun helped them understand how their immigration experience had created survival mentalities that persisted long after they had achieved stability, leading to hoarding behaviors around both money and family loyalty that ultimately harmed everyone involved. My own patterns of people-pleasing and boundary crossing were examined with equal scrutiny. I had to confront uncomfortable truths about how my identity had become so intertwined with being needed and useful that I had lost track of my own wants, needs, and legitimate expectations from relationships. The family therapy sessions revealed layers of dysfunction that none of us had fully understood. Kevin's resentment toward me wasn't just about jealousy over my success, but about the pressure he felt to live up to an impossible standard while simultaneously being protected from real consequences. My parents' treatment of us had created a dynamic where neither child could develop healthy autonomy or self-respect. Dr. Chin introduced concepts like parentification, explaining how I had been forced into adult responsibilities from childhood, and learned helplessness, describing how Kevin had been systematically prevented from developing independence and problem-solving skills. The sessions were painful but illuminating, providing vocabulary and frameworks for experiences that had previously felt confusing and personal. Not all of the healing was successful or complete. Kevin's recovery remained fragile, marked by periods of progress followed by setbacks that tested everyone's commitment to change. His resentment toward me persisted even after months of therapy, manifesting in subtle attempts to undermine my relationship with our parents or minimize my contributions to his treatment and recovery. During one particularly difficult family session, Kevin accused me of abandoning him during his darkest period, claiming that my refusal to bail him out had made his legal problems worse and delayed his access to treatment. The accusation was emotionally devastating because it contained just enough truth to trigger my deep-seated fears about selfishness and family loyalty. Dr. Chun guided us through this confrontation with professional skill, helping Kevin understand how his expectation of rescue had prevented him from taking responsibility for his actions, while also validating my decision to set boundaries around enabling behavior. The conversation was raw and painful, but it marked a turning point in Kevin's ability to acknowledge his own role in the family dysfunction. My father struggled more than my mother with accepting the new dynamics, often reverting to old patterns of expectation and control when stress levels increased. His traditional values and immigrant mentality made it difficult for him to understand concepts like emotional boundaries and individual autonomy, particularly as they applied to daughters in Chinese families. During family dinners, he would sometimes slip back into discussing my salary, my savings, or my potential contributions to family expenses, despite repeated requests to avoid these topics. The conversations weren't malicious, but they reflected deeply ingrained assumptions about family hierarchy and resource sharing that were difficult to change after decades of reinforcement. There were setbacks, arguments, and periods of estrangement that tested everyone's commitment to change. When Kevin relapsed and was arrested again 6 months after completing his initial treatment program, my parents initially turned to me for financial assistance before catching themselves and seeking help through his treatment program instead. The incident revealed how easily old patterns could reassert themselves during crisis periods, but it also demonstrated genuine progress in my parents' willingness to recognize and correct their behavior. My mother called me to discuss Kevin's situation, but made clear that she was sharing information rather than requesting assistance, a distinction that represented significant growth in her understanding of appropriate boundaries. But the fundamental shift had occurred. I no longer structured my life around their approval or allowed their emergencies to become my crises. I maintained financial boundaries even when they struggled with expenses, offering emotional support and practical advice instead of monetary solutions. I spent holidays with friends when family gatherings became toxic, prioritizing my own well-being over family harmony. The process of learning to say no was gradual and often difficult. Each boundary I set required careful consideration and preparation, along with ongoing support from Dr. Walsh to process the guilt and anxiety that accompanied these decisions. I had to practice phrases like, "I'm not able to help with that," and "that doesn't work for me," until they felt natural rather than confrontational. I chose my own priorities and defended them consistently, even when doing so disappointed people I loved. When my parents planned a family vacation that would require me to take unpaid time off and contribute financially to expenses I couldn't afford, I declined despite weeks of pressure and guilt-inducing conversations about family traditions and missed opportunities. The professional success continued to build momentum as I gained confidence and clarity about my career goals. 2 years after setting boundaries with my family, I was offered a senior engineering position at a startup founded by former colleagues who valued my technical skills and leadership potential. The company was developing innovative educational software, combining my technical expertise with the teaching skills I had developed through years of tutoring and volunteer work. The startup environment was challenging but exhilarating, requiring me to wear multiple hats and take on responsibilities far beyond my previous corporate role. I led a team of developers, managed client relationships, and contributed to product strategy decisions that would shape the company's future direction. The financial compensation included equity shares that would eventually become valuable when the company was acquired by a major technology firm. The acquisition process was complex and stressful, involving due diligence investigations, contract negotiations, and integration planning that consumed months of intensive work. The financial windfall from that acquisition allowed me to purchase my own home and begin seriously planning for early retirement. The house was a charming craftsman bungalow in a tree-lined neighborhood, with a large kitchen where I could experiment with cooking, a studio space for my art projects, and a garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers. More importantly, I had learned to pursue relationships that enhanced rather than depleted my energy. The process of dating after years of isolation was awkward and sometimes discouraging, but I gradually developed confidence in my ability to assess compatibility and maintain healthy boundaries with romantic partners. I began dating Marcus, a colleague from the educational software company who shared my interests in art and technology. Our relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and genuine compatibility rather than desperate need or obligation. Marcus had his own experiences with family boundary setting, having grown up in a household where his parents' financial irresponsibility had created similar patterns of emotional manipulation and guilt. Our shared understanding of family dysfunction created a foundation of empathy and support that I had never experienced in romantic relationships. We could discuss the ongoing challenges of maintaining boundaries without judgment or advice, simply offering presence and validation for the complex emotions involved in family healing. When I eventually introduced Marcus to my family, the interactions were cordial but not central to our relationship. My parents were polite and welcoming, but they had learned not to interrogate my romantic choices or offer unsolicited advice about marriage and children. The relationship existed independently of family approval, a concept that had once seemed impossible but now felt natural and healthy. Maya and I rekindled our friendship, spending hours on phone calls catching up on the years we had lost to my family obligations. She visited me in my new home, marveling at the transformation in both my living situation and my personal confidence. We planned trips together, attended art shows and concerts, and rebuilt the kind of supportive friendship that had sustained us during college. Through Maya, I met other women who had similar experiences with family boundary setting, forming an informal support group that met monthly to discuss challenges and celebrate victories. The group included women from various cultural backgrounds who had navigated similar conflicts between family expectations and personal autonomy. The solidarity was healing in ways I hadn't anticipated, providing a chosen family that complemented rather than replaced my biological one. These friendships were based on mutual support and shared values rather than obligation and guilt, creating relationships that felt sustainable and nourishing rather than draining and stressful. The artistic pursuits I had abandoned returned as a source of joy and fulfillment. I took classes in painting, pottery, and creative writing, discovering talents that had been dormant for years. My home filled with artwork I had created, evidence of time spent nurturing myself rather than managing other people's problems. Elena Rodriguez, my art teacher, became a mentor and friend who encouraged me to exhibit my work in local galleries and art fairs. The first time I sold a painting to a stranger who genuinely admired my artistic vision, I experienced a pride that was entirely my own, unconnected to family expectations or professional obligations. The creative work also provided an outlet for processing the complex emotions involved in family healing. I painted abstract pieces that expressed the anger and grief I felt about lost years, landscapes that captured the peace I had found in my new life, and portraits that explored themes of identity and independence. Writing became another form of healing, allowing me to document my journey and reflect on the lessons I had learned. I started a blog about family boundaries and cultural expectations, sharing my story with others who might be struggling with similar issues. The response was overwhelming, with hundreds of comments from readers who recognized their own experiences in my words. The blog evolved into speaking opportunities at conferences and workshops focused on family systems, cultural identity, and personal development. I found fulfillment in helping others navigate the complex process of boundary setting, offering practical advice and emotional support based on my own hard-won experience. 5 years after that pivotal phone conversation in my cubicle, I found myself in a position I had never imagined possible. I was financially secure, professionally fulfilled, romantically happy, and surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. The relationship with my family had evolved into something more honest and sustainable, built on respect rather than exploitation. My parents and I now had monthly dinners where we focused on genuine connection rather than crisis management. They had learned to share their struggles without automatically expecting me to solve them, while I had learned to offer emotional support without feeling obligated to provide financial rescue. The conversations were different now, focusing on their interests, my creative projects, and shared memories rather than problems that needed fixing. My mother had started taking art classes herself, inspired by my renewed interest in painting, and we sometimes visited galleries together or discussed techniques and artistic inspiration. My father had begun delegating more responsibilities at his repair shop, finally accepting that his arthritis required accommodation rather than denial. He hired a young assistant and began focusing on customer relationships and business development rather than the physical demands of electronics repair. Kevin's recovery remained an ongoing process, marked by genuine progress, but still fragile and requiring continuous effort. He had completed multiple treatment programs, found stable employment as a substance abuse counselor, and was living independently in a small apartment near his workplace. Our relationship was cordial but limited, built on realistic expectations rather than forced intimacy. He had apologized for his past behavior and expressed gratitude for my decision to stop enabling his destructive choices, acknowledging that my boundaries had ultimately contributed to his recovery by forcing him to face consequences. However, trust was still fragile, and our interactions remained somewhat formal and cautious. Kevin was employed and taking responsibility for his own choices and consequences, but the years of manipulation and resentment had created emotional distance that might never be fully bridged. The transformation had not erased the years of pain or the complicated grief that comes with recognizing how much time was lost to dysfunction. But it had proven that change was possible, that love could exist alongside boundaries, and that family relationships could evolve beyond their most toxic origins. During therapy sessions, I continued to process the complex emotions involved in family healing. Some weeks brought anger about the opportunities one had missed, the relationships I had avoided, and the dreams I had postponed. Other weeks brought sadness about the family unity I had imagined but never actually experienced. Dr. Walsh helped me understand that grief for an idealized family was normal and healthy, part of the process of accepting reality rather than continuing to chase an impossible fantasy. The family I had always wanted might never exist, but the family I actually had could still provide meaningful connection within appropriate boundaries. During a recent therapy session, Dr. Walsh asked me what I had learned from the experience that I wished I could tell my younger self. The answer came without hesitation. That saying no to the wrong things is the only way to say yes to the right things. That family love shouldn't require you to sacrifice your dreams, your financial security, or your peace of mind. That the people who truly love you will want you to thrive, not just survive. The young woman who had answered that phone call 5 years ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood that her worth was not determined by her usefulness to others. The guilt and fear that had controlled her decisions had been replaced by clarity and self-respect. The life of obligation and resentment had transformed into one of choice and fulfillment. As I write this, I am preparing for another family dinner, but this time the anticipation is pleasant rather than anxious. I will drive to my parents' house in my own car, funded by my own success, and leave whenever I choose. I will offer support and care within boundaries I have clearly defined and consistently maintained. I will be a daughter, but not at the expense of being myself. The journey from victim to survivor to someone who thrives required more courage than I knew I possessed, but it also revealed strength I never knew existed. It taught me that family is not just about blood and obligation, but about mutual respect and genuine care. It showed me that the love worth having is the love that makes space for your authentic self to flourish. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people who are hurting you is to stop enabling their harmful behavior. Sometimes the most loyal thing you can do for your family is to refuse to participate in dysfunction. Sometimes the most responsible thing you can do is to take responsibility for your own life and let others do the same. I still struggle sometimes with old patterns of guilt and people-pleasing. The voices of obligation and sacrifice still whisper in moments of stress and uncertainty, but they no longer control my decisions or define my worth. I have learned to listen to them with compassion for the scared young woman who internalized those messages, then choose a different path based on wisdom rather than fear. The family I was born into taught me about sacrifice and endurance. The family I chose taught me about respect and joy. The family I am building with Marcus teaches me about partnership and mutual support. Each has contributed to the person I am today, but none defines the limits of who I can become. If you are reading this and recognizing your own story in mine, please know that change is possible. The relationships that have shaped you do not have to control you forever. The love you deserve exists, and it does not require you to diminish yourself to receive it. The life you want is possible, but it may require you to disappoint people who have grown comfortable with your sacrifice. The journey is not easy, and it is not quick. There will be moments of doubt, periods of loneliness, and setbacks that test your resolve. But on the other side of that difficulty lies a freedom you may have forgotten was possible. On the other side lies the person you were meant to be before obligation and fear taught you to be smaller than your dreams. You are worth fighting for. Your dreams are worth protecting. Your peace is worth defending. And the people who truly love you will ultimately be grateful that you had the courage to save yourself, even when they could not understand or support your choice to do so. The weight of expectations nearly crushed me, but learning to set it down saved my life. Now I carry only what belongs to me, and the difference is the space where joy lives, where dreams grow, and where love exists without conditions or price tags. That space is yours too, if you are brave enough to claim it.